Welcome to Musicians versus the World, the podcast where we explore aspects of music and musician life that may not have been covered in music school. I am your host, Christine Smith, and today we are talking with Carlos Baker, who is sharing his story of overcoming childhood cancer and using creativity through becoming a songwriter and an author to deal with the emotional aftermath. Songwriter, bass player, and author Carlos Baker is an American-born musician who moved to northern Germany in 2009. In 2020, he penned the novel Songs for Ivy, which is available on Amazon. Carlos has written over 50 songs ranging from country to ballads to rock and blues. He writes songs that are filled with raw emotion, many of which deal with his personal experiences and struggles with depression. But above all, Carlos is most proud of the 4 children that he and his wife have raised. So Carlos Baker, it is so wonderful to see you, and thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Musicians versus the World.
Oh my, thank you for having me. It's awesome.
I can't wait to hear about your story and about your music. I know that you have used your music to process lots of your life events and how music and your life are so deeply intertwined, and I just can't wait to hear what you have to say. So let's start from the beginning. Have you always known you've wanted to be a musician, or is that something that developed later in life?
I definitely music was always in our lives. My mom always made sure that music was in my brother and I's life, whether it be, all the lessons as kids. And then in high school, I found some connection with bass, enough to kind of play in crappy bands and, screw around. But really the living kind of the life of a real live artist / musician started in my mid-30s. So I'm super late bloomer, man, I'm 49 now. So I think life for me has unfolded in kind of, I always lived like a free, for lack of a better term, kind of have that free spirit type of approach to life. And it wasn't really until I fell into these dark depressions in my mid-50s, in my mid-30s, that music really became a major part of my life, specifically the writing. I think the writing of the lyrics and the songs that were kind of showing themselves was a huge part of my getting through those dark times, because I do feel like so much of it was like, oh, I have a handful of songs now. I guess I'm a songwriter. Up until this point, I've never sat down and been like, I'm going to write a song about this topic. I'm always listening and aware if anything wants to come out. And if it comes out, I'm always ready to capture it. That's the best part. When you're lucky enough to capture a song that wants to come out, there's nothing better for me, man.
Yeah. So it was your mid-30s, you said, when the songwriting really became part of you. Is there a moment where it just started? Was there a moment in time where you're like, I'm going to try songwriting to get some of my thoughts out? Or what was that? How did that happen?
I don't think so. So going back a little bit, when I was a kid, I had cancer. So when I was 12 years old, up until 12, I was like a normal 12-year-old boy, came from a really nice family. We lived on a farm. So we had a very, kind of a beautiful childhood where we had all the motorcycles and the toys and all that. I had been complaining to my family that the circulation in my left foot was like pins and needles very often. So that probably for 6 months. And finally, my pops and I went into a walk-in clinic in East Providence, Rhode Island. And the doctor took a look at my knee and he's like, yeah, it looks a little swollen. We'll take an x-ray. And he did take an x-ray. And when he walked into the room, even as a 12-year-old, I vividly remember, even as a 12-year-old, I knew something was wrong because his energy had changed so dramatically. And he was like, well, there's something in there. We're going to send you, I just called a colleague at the hospital in Rhode Island. I'm going to send you over there to take some more pictures. Ultimately, after we had ran into him months later, he knew it was something called osteogenic sarcoma. So a bone cancer rare bone cancer that generally happens to kids in their teenage years. And from there began this insane 2-year fight for my life against cancer. So
wow.
It started in my in my knee, went to both my lungs, chemotherapy, surgery, chances of survival, 0%. And for whatever reason, ultimately, I lived, who
Oh my
knows
goodness.
why, but I was one of the lucky ones that had 0% chance of survival and I lived. And ultimately, yeah, to me, by the way, this story is so non-emotional to me because
Yeah.
it was 40 years ago and whatever, yeah, 40 years ago. And I've told it so many times, but I'm aware that it's always kind of shocking when I first, but ultimately,
Yeah.
they tried to save my left leg for a couple of years, even when I was in remission. Ultimately, we made the decision to amputate it to the middle of my thigh. So I have about 19 inches of femur bone. So I've lived that way for 30 plus years as an amputee. Um, and kind of my way of dealing with it was just pretending like I was a normal guy. I just didn't really interact with the world as a handicapped dude. Just lived like normal guy, didn't talk about it,
Right.
maybe typical, and that worked for me through my entire life, but the way I dealt with it was not taking anything serious. So I didn't do well in high school. I went to college and I graduated, but I didn't really take college seriously. And then post college, I was just working at like coffee shops and just at no point was I ready to kind of, take life seriously,
Yeah.
until I got married and had a bunch of kids. And then I went to work for family business and bought a house and had a mortgage. And although I was relatively content, it just overwhelmed my senses. I've done a tremendous amount of work to understand this time in my life or that time in my life, but ultimately my brain just got overwhelmed and it shut down and I could no longer function.
Well, yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can imagine because that's what normal people do. But in my case, it didn't, I couldn't handle it. So I went into this insane, not able to function a couple of years of my life. So ultimately, my wife and I decided to move to the little village where she was born and raised in northern Germany.
Mm.
And we threw everything we owned in our container and our three kids, 7, 6, and 4, we moved to this little village and kind of started over, which I think is probably the best thing I could have ever done because it gave me some sort of a new lease on life. Once I went to work and had kids, I just put all my music equipment in the basement. Now I was like, I'm not a musician anymore. I would even say it out loud. I'd be like, those days are over, man. I don't sing anymore. I don't, that's it. And when we were packing all our stuff, I was going to sell I have a beautiful mid 50s K bass, upright bass that I've had all my life. And she's beautiful. And I was going to sell it. It was like worth $1,500. And at that point, there was a few, it helped.
Yeah.
And my wife, she's like, no, bring it to Germany. And I'm like, nah, I'm not going to play. And she's like, bring it to Germany. Maybe you'll make time for it. So we did pack it up. And as soon as we landed in Germany and I unpacked my stuff, I started playing again. And I swear from that day one, I never put my bass down. I immediately became a musician again. Like it was, or maybe not even a musician. I immediately started interacting with the world as an artist. Very
Okay.
strange. I immediately started wanting to write more. I don't know how much experience you have with depression, but in my case, there's the depression and then there's the post-depression once you've got on some meds and found some sort of a, neutral space again. Then there's the emotions you have to deal with. And for me, the emotion was shame. It's like, okay,
Oh.
why couldn't I handle life? I think this ultimately answers the first question is that's when the writing was directly kind of helping me process that stuff because the songs and the lyrics that were coming out were all quite dark. They were
Mm-hmm.
all speaking to the monster, or I always thought of the anxiety and depression as a monster kind of inside you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's where the lyrics were really helping me. I didn't know it, right? I didn't know it at the time, but when they came out, there was value to them for me. And that went on for years where I was not necessarily doing much with the songs. I knew they were happening, but it was rather intuitive. I wasn't kind of intentionally being like, oh, that's cool. I have a album's worth of tunes now. That took a minute to create the confidence to go to other musicians and be
Oh
like,
yeah.
you know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
I have some songs you want to play through it. And I do remember the moment that I brought my first song to a wonderful, wonderful musician who's been with me for over a decade now. And we were practicing for like a crappy, party gig, like cover gig. And I was like, he's German.
Uh-huh.
Our relationship is he speaks 100% in German. I speak in English because I understand German after 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we interact. So I was like, I had this tune, you want to check it out? It was just the two of us. And he's like, sure. And I played it through him, and I played it for him, and we kind of worked through it. And he's like, and just his reaction was so great. Like he was like, so you wrote the song? And I'm like, yeah, I got a bunch of songs. And he's like, okay, you like, and then I'm like, oh, maybe there's value to this. You know what I mean? There was a moment, and he and I talk about it still to this day. I love him very much. His name is Christoph on Storage, and he gets a kick out of that memory too, because it's probably our favorite song to play on stage, and it's it's a smart song. It's called Two Bad Bricks, and it talks about that basically, this concept of wanting to tear down a wall, and at some point recognizing that our flaws are who we are, man. That's I feel like I only have flaws someday, but
Don't we all?
yeah, but it makes me who I am.
What do you think it is about music that was so cathartic? Like why do you think it was music that became your medium to process all of these kind of pent up emotions?
I I think you mentioned in the intro, I did write a book that I'm
Mm-hmm.
super, super proud of. And the question was, why did I choose music to help get through my kind of emotional issues? I don't think it was just music and just lyrics. I think it was maybe the reality is I'm not a regular guy. So I think when I moved to Germany and started thinking and acting like an artist, kind of started thinking of myself as like an artist, it made me feel so comfortable. Like that space was so comfortable for me. I was like, yeah, I can be an artist. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that general thought process made the lyrics and the writing and the sharing, it made me happy, or if not happy, it brought me some sort of contentness that I hadn't felt, or that I wanted to feel again. Maybe as
Mm-hmm.
probably had felt that when I was a kid, but that I missed because of those years of being in such turmoil, what's worse than inner turmoil?
Yeah. So your creative process is very much like a free flowing type of process, regardless of if it's music or writing or.
It's definitely, and I'm sure you know better than anyone is what if you choose to be an artist, what we need more than anything is time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't have time to let that stuff happen, and if you don't have time to be listening for stuff, right? Because I find right now I've been in Chicago for 7 weeks, working a regular job, having a time of my life, working hard all day, every day. But I have written a handful of lyrics, and normally as soon as lyrics would happen, the melody generally comes with it. And I'm like, I'm attacking, trying to find it. And I've been here for 7 weeks and there's just no time, so
Right.
I think that's also the fact that we moved, the fact that I didn't have any, I didn't know the language in Germany at the time. I was also in a place where I was trying to find myself. It all brought me to this very beautiful, cathartic place of creativity. And I'm a bit of a monk, man.
Yeah. Your own hermitage, if you will.
That's right.
That's great. I love that you found so much freedom and able to express yourself through all of that. So you said you're in Chicago now. What is next for you? You've got a band, CK Baker Band, right? What are your next things?
Yeah, last year. So I put a little money to a project to make an album, and we did it kind of the way I think maybe most albums are made nowadays, where everyone was kind of all my buddies from Germany, the musicians that I know, we were all creating our parts in our little home studios.
Right.
I used a gentleman in Nashville that I just kind of seeked out and listened to some of the stuff he did, and I liked it. He put it together, mixed it, and mastered it, and all that stuff. And the project is cool. It was called Walk Alone, and it's good. It's a decent album, but to me, it sounds a little bit kind of disconnected.
Oh, okay.
Just not as pure as I would have liked it. But it's my my album. It's my lyrics. It's my songs. Me singing them. So I love it. But I did want to experience working with a real producer. I wanted to know what it was like. None of it with the ultimate goal of becoming famous and making $1 million. Just I wanted the experience. And I looked around and found this gentleman named Brian Deck. He's a little bit older, kind of towards I think he'd be okay with me saying this, kind of towards the end of his career. So a white-haired gentleman. And he's worked with he's a real guy. He's worked with the Counting Crows, and he worked with Sam from Iron and Wine. And so, he's a real dude, but he's a little bit older. And I reached out to him, and we kind of hit it off. I was in Germany at the time. We hit it off via video call, and he agreed to take me on, which was so cool because he's such an honest guy. Like I was like, so when he agreed, I was like, Brian, do you usually work with, guys like me that don't really, don't have a name, stuff like that? And he was like, Carlos, the Counting Crows make an album once every decade. I make a living off guys like you. But he set the tone early to say, I'm not going to sugarcoat anything with you, man.
Right.
Which is great, right? So ultimately, I moved here last year, right at the beginning of the year, and he and I worked for 6 months together. We became very close. Very fatherly relationship, and I don't know that I knew. I don't know if anyone knows, because maybe everyone's different. But I wasn't sure what the producer's role was going to be, so that was part of the excitement for me to see how it all unfolds. And I was not disappointed, man. The process from day one of kind of the pre-production process and the way he looked at my songs, and the trust that I had to give him to kind of tear apart my lyrics, which maybe is the hardest part.
Right. Yeah.
But from day one, the little the lessons, like, so the day I got there, so I don't play a corded instrument. I can fake my way around guitar, but I can't. I'm not a high level guitar player. So I literally write my songs on bass, which is very, very odd, right? And then and the melodies. So I'll play a bass line with the melody and the lyrics. When I showed up at his place, he was just like, well, this is the first time in my career that I've done this. This is interesting, And so we sit down and the song "Ill Prepared," which is one of the first songs I've ever written, and maybe the song that I love the most of all my songs. So that was the one I chose to work on first. And he immediately starts kind of like crossing out like lines and jotting things in the you know,
In the margins, yeah.
and the margins. And I'm like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into, you know?
It was good you had written that book and have already learned how to deal with an editor. Probably softened that a little bit.
Yeah, but this was so different. I was like, no, not that word. That word is the so he was doing this, and then at the end of that session, we were doing like 4-hour pre-production sessions. And at the end of that one, he's like, okay, let me explain let me explain what we just did today. And he was like, so and then he kind of went into this thing of there's the melody, the song melody, and then there's these syllabic melody. And he was quick to explain that he's like, you're jamming too much into your lines. You're putting too much into these statements, and the listener is going to have. So he had his take on the syllables that I had generally created. So he's like, so what I did here when I crossed out these words and jotted in these other words, these are just filler words. So these are the amount of syllables I think you need to use to find different ways to express yourself. And then this was the statement that he made day one. He's like, just remember, I'm not a songwriter. I don't have that talent. You're the songwriter. I'm just telling you what I have learned over my career on this specific issue. And for a guy that has a thing, he's done it. He's been there. He's had success.
Mm-hmm.
For him to say, you have something that I don't have, and now you have to use that in order that's your homework. Like that was day one. I'm like, oh yeah, okay. He just told me that I maybe have talent. That little glimmer of, I'm like, oh my God, yeah, I think I can do this, you know?
Yeah.
So, for me, those lessons were as important as anything. And there was a bunch of those, when I often make statements like, well, I'm not a real musician. I'm a bass player. And then he'd yell at me. He'd be like, dude, you just came here with all these, wonderful songs, and and he would just kind of put me in my place to say, don't say stuff like that. And
yeah,
I needed that, man. I needed someone other than my friends and family to tell me,
right.
Tell me that, you gotta switch you gotta change a little. But we had so much fun. That process, the pre-production process was intense, and he insisted that we, from a cost standpoint, an expense standpoint, that until we're done with that pre-production process, we're not going to go to the studio. He really was big on that the songs have to be ready. And it was expensive. It was an expensive experience. I did raise some money from family. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, when we got into the studio, so basically I would take all the stuff that we'd go through in these 4-hour sessions. Then I'd go home to this apartment that I was living in with my little home studio, and I'd create demos with those changes, right? Whether it be chord changes or on Cubase. And again, I'm not a guitar player or piano player, but with Cubase, you can.
Yeah, you can do that.
With a mouse, So ultimately we had 10, after 4 months or something, 3 months, we had 10 finished demos that they were done, and we were going to create the songs that sounded just like this as far as shape, right? So I don't know if I'm stating the obvious for your listeners that, yeah, this is what producers do. But for me, I didn't know that this was going to be, I didn't know exactly what he was going to do. And maybe all producers are different, but he was as much psychiatrist and psychologist as he was, music producer to me. I do feel like that, he was also tough. Like he'd like yell at me, I'm like, oh, sorry, like he'd be like trying to work something out. He's like, can you effing shut up? I'm trying to figure, I'm like, oh, sorry. So, which again, I love. I'm like, bring it, man. Bring that passion. I'm cool with that. Mm-hmm. But ultimately when he brought his guys in, his studio guys, which of course was incredibly nerve-wracking for me because I was the guy in the room that was going to tell them or something. And I even brought a bass player. I even made the decision that I wanted a studio bass player to interpret what we were trying to make. That was
Wow.
Yeah, which is weird, right?
A little bit, yeah.
It was important for me because I have my bass playing style, but it's limited in its own way, and I want to hear I just wanted to hear what it sounded like in a place where it's super fresh. And we did it the old way, where everyone was in one room. You know, everyone was mic'd in separate rooms, and I just had headphones and was singing in the same room. So those 5 days of tracking were so cool, and listening to Brian speak to his guys in a language that I couldn't follow. So in a language of really producer speaking to studio musicians about, the album, the 76 album from Ziggy Stardust, third track, how so-and-so did that. These conversations they were having were so great. I was just like, man, this is worth my money, or just this.
Right. Yeah, like a master class in producing. And
yeah, and nothing I could ever, at my age, nothing I could ever learn, right? They can have this conversation because they've been doing it for 40 years.
Right.
And not to say I don't want to learn that. It's a different skill, but beautiful to watch. And then we'd go in, we'd be like, okay, let's go. We'd listen to my shitty demo, and then we'd go in and just listening to these guys, whatever was going on in their heads, the ideas that they come up with, and kind of one take after another, finding it, kind of, Brian pushing them in a certain direction, and one song of all the songs, this song "Ill Prepared," the one I mentioned, we got that in one take. They had never seen the chord changes. It's not a super complex tune, but we played it. It was so pure and so perfect. Brian over the speaker was like, "What do you think, guys?" And we all kind of looked at each other, and the guitarist was like, "Well, it's not going to get better than that. We can do another take if you want." And I was like, "No. This is the story. The story is that was the first take." And I obviously, that was dummy vocals. Ultimately, I did vocals over them, and then we added some synth after. But that song is as personal as it was always to me. The fact that I listen to our album now and I'm like, oh yeah, that's the one. I love that stuff, man. I live for those little things.
Yeah,
that means something to me.
That's so great. I love your story. Thank you so much for sharing it. And like, you just come full circle, and you're this artist, and you've been able to have your own solitude where you just had this creative output, and then you get to work with these legends and learn from them. Like, what an amazing full life you're living. I love it. As we finish up, do you have any last minute advice for other people who want to be musicians or want to tap into their creative outlet? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I would say, I think we touched on it, is make the time for it. I often say to my friends and family that say, how do you write songs? I'm like, put an hour aside alone in a room with a notebook and try, it's not rocket science, man. And everyone's like, well, if I do that, my lyrics all sound cheesy. I'm like, all lyrics sound cheesy. You just got to sell them, have you read my lyrics? So I think if you want to be a musician, if you have any, kind of idea that you have some talent in yet, just make it happen, man. Sit in a room, put stuff down, 3 chords. It starts there, right?
All right. Yeah. Don't be afraid to fail. That's for sure.
Oh God, failure's the best. That's all I know. That's all I know. Terrible ending.
Oh, no, you're great. Carlos, this has been such a pleasure to chat with you. And I'm just so inspired by your story and by your tenacity and your creative output. So just thank you so much for talking with me and spending the time.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate it so much.
But my spirit will live on, more alive